professor here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. And it really is a delight to have all of you here today and to have our featured speaker here today to discuss a really important issue. So Melanie Kenderdine, many of you know, she's no stranger to the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia or to people who pay attention to energy policy. She joined the Department of Energy in May 2013 to direct the Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis and serve as Energy Counselor to Secretary Moniz. That sounds obscure and bureaucratic, but far from it. There are a few people in the Department of Energy who have as much responsibility, influence, involvement in just about every important policy decision that the Department of Energy makes. She has played a key role in a host of issues related to policy development analysis, including the Quadrennial Energy Review. One news story quoted a former DOE senior staff member as saying that the staff members in Melanie's policy shop are the rock stars of the Department of Energy. And and she was listed in the National Journal along with 2 cabinet members and 2 senators as one of the top 5 women who shape energy policy in Washington, D.C. And she's been with us before to speak about policy, but also to spend time with female students here as part of the Women in Energy program that we've created at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Prior to her current role at DOE, she helped to run the MIT Energy Initiative. Before that was with the Gas Technology Institute, and previously served in lots of senior roles in the Clinton administration in the Energy Department, and has been a great friend and counselor and supporter of what we're doing here at Columbia, and a great friend to me personally. The issue of water and energy and how they come together is enormously important. We recognize that based on what's happening in the world increasingly each and every day. It's an area that has attracted increased attention from policymakers, from researchers, from people in the private sector, and it's why so many people here at Columbia are spending as much time as they are in the issue, including the team at the Energy Center. So I'm really delighted to welcome Melanie here today to speak about it, and then to take some questions about not only this topic, but the state of energy policy more broadly, maybe what's happening in Paris, and a few other issues that are top of mind for lots of people. So I'll ask people to silence their cell phones. For those of you watching online, I'll remind you you're able to submit questions via Twitter at the hashtag CGEP events. Send them to @ColumbiaUEnergy. And we'll listen to Melanie and her presentation, and then we'll have about 45 minutes or so for conversation and discussion. So please join me in welcoming Melanie Kenderdine.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you all for coming. I see a couple of old friends in the audience. Peter Davidson pulled the DOE loan program into great shape, and now he's off and doing some wonderful things elsewhere. Aligned intermediary is what, okay, all right. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and as Jason said, I'm going to talk about the energy-water nexus and talk about climate change as well, and how climate change affects the energy-water nexus. That's obviously a hot topic these days, as the Secretary right now is over in Paris at linked and mutually dependent, with each affecting the other's availability. I can tell this is written by science, by academics. It's a tough sentence, but there is growing recognition about the linkages between water and energy. And right here we have water for energy, which is what and use conditioning. And so I'll talk a little bit about those. First, I'm going to talk about energy and water challenges. And by 500%. And a couple more data points on that. 82% of energy companies and 73% of power utility executives say that water is a substantial risk to their operations. And 59% of energy companies and 67% of power utilities have experienced water-related business impacts in the last 5 years. A little bit more on challenges. This is an energy challenge. The Sankey diagram, I actually have two. We always have to have Sankey diagrams in Department of Energy presentations. This is a forecast of global energy consumption in 2030, which is 680 quads a year. Over here, that big gray bar, that's rejected energy. Almost below that, the bar right below that is useful energy. So we are rejecting almost as much energy as we are using, and that's a big target space for innovation and energy R&D. Up here, those little bitty strings, those are your renewable generation technologies or renewable technologies. And those, you've got coal, natural gas, the great big bars, oil is obviously. And the point on that is that we have to convert all of those little tiny strings into the great big fat bars. And this, I remind you, is a 2030 forecast. And so it is a very short time frame that we have. They're over in Paris today talking about 2 degrees Celsius, and energy systems don't change that quickly. So it is an enormous challenge that we are facing in the U.S. and in the world. This is an energy equity issue. This is annual per capita electricity consumption. And there is a direct correlation between electricity consumption and the UN's Human Development Index. And what you see on the x-axis, that's annual per capita electricity consumption, and on the y-axis is where countries fall on the Human Development Index. And what you see, the blue, very high on the Human Development Index and very high electricity consumption, and you start moving down the chain to where you get to countries that it's the 1.3 billion that actually lack access to electricity. And just read the end of that. All countries that have reached higher development levels in the past have increasingly used energy-intensive inputs like steel and cement, and it is hardly plausible that this correlation will break in the near future. So there are enormous energy equity issues associated with electricity, and in order to meet the electricity demand and to move those least developed countries up on this Human Development Index, we're going to need a lot more energy and electricity, which is problematic when we are trying to address issues like climate change. These are modeled impacts of climate change, and forgive the cartoon, but I like maps. Maps are strategic. These are areas, this is what we expect in a 2 to 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. So that's what you're seeing here are the modeled impacts. Those are all the areas of the world where you're going to see increased deserts. And according to the UN, these deserts put at risk the health and well-being of 1.2 billion people in more than 100 countries. As a result of increased aridity, for example, water availability in southern Europe is expected to decline by 20%. Africa, this will put 250 million people at risk of water shortages. This is where you're seeing the deserts grow and increased temperatures. You're also going to see increased wildfires. We already have. And I found this interesting when I was preparing for this talk. In January of 2013, Australia's Bureau of Meteorology had to add a new color to the top of its temperature forecast scale. Because it's hot, and they have had enormous fires wildfires in Australia, and we've had similar fires in the western United States. The glaciers are melting, both in the Andes and in the Himalayas. Most of the small glaciers in the world have already melted. In the Hindu Kush, high levels of discharge are typically between April and September, and now they're between April and May. The disappearance of glaciers will represent a serious water challenge to 1/6 of the world's populations. In the short term, this will cause lakes to expand and bring floods and mud flows in these regions of the world. And in the long run, the glaciers this will reduce the water supply to these regions. Also, South America and in Asia to some extent, South America gets a disproportionate amount of its electricity from hydro, and this will have a serious impact on hydro generation. I've been worried for some time that that is part of an adaptation strategy, is dealing with those glaciers. You are going to see increased precipitation around the world. You're seeing areas where they expect increases, and we've seen this in this part of the country after Hurricane Sandy and in other places. Hurricane Sandy destroyed neighborhoods along the coast and killed 159 people and knocked out power to 8.6 million customers. You're going to see increased weather-related events. I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. 5 to 10% increase in hurricane wind speed. You're also going to see increased flooding. We saw that in the Gulf of Mexico and in parts of Asia. And this is why I really wanted to show you this slide. These are the countries in the world where they grow the most. This is wheat, for example. So this is where your wheat crops are located. This is where your corn crops are located. Corn is the largest grain crop in the world, will be severely affected by climate change and water availability. And this is where rice is grown. And in Africa, agriculture is almost 95% rain-fed. And so if you see a reduction in precipitation, it's a serious problem for many parts of the world that are growing our grain. And let me just skip through this. You all know about Arctic sea ice decline and sea level rises. Going back to the grains. This is the impacts of water stress on global grain supplies. And these are 28% of the world lives in water-scarce countries. Experts estimate that by 2080, this number will climb to 43 to 50%. And what you're seeing on this map is the yellow are low to medium water-stressed areas. The orange and the red are high-stressed areas. And what you see, I have put where the wheat and the maize and the rice are grown, and almost all of it, with the exception of South America, and you see extreme water stress by 2040. And so this is a serious problem with climate change and global food supplies. This is land use intensity by energy source. And people don't look at this very often. Huge issues in a place like Europe where you don't have a lot of land availability and huge population densities. This is square kilometers and terawatt hours per year is what you're looking here. So nuclear, you're getting the most power for the land use. Then you go all the way down there to electricity and biomass and biodiesel and corn. And for the amount of energy that you're getting, you need a huge amount of land compared to something like nuclear, coal, solar thermals, not very high, natural gas, et cetera, et cetera. This is water use for primary energy production. The dark green is withdrawals and the light green is consumption. And just a couple of points about here, your lowest is conventional gas. That's at the very top here. Shale production is still pretty commensurate with coal. And even though there's a lot of talk about all of the gas that you use or the water that you use to produce shale gas, it's not showing up here. And again, you get down to the bottom of this graph and you see enormous amounts of water withdrawal and consumption for your for sugarcane ethanol, corn ethanol, and your biodiesels. This is changes in precipitation, and this is the percentage changes in the 21st century. And the red is a loss of precipitation of 40% by the end of the 21st century, and purple is an increase in 40%. And the one thing that jumped out at me when I looked at this map is the Mediterranean ring. If you look at the Mediterranean ring, it is amazing when you look at this modeling, and it's similar to the water stress map, although not exactly the same. But it's especially a concern to me when you look at current events, the war, the migration, the instability, and so the Mediterranean ring stands out as problematic, and you could already be seeing the impacts of climate change on some of the other issues that I just mentioned. Certainly migration is one of them, and we're dealing with that issue now. And this is per capita electricity consumption in the Mediterranean ring. I was interested in the immigration that we've seen. And what you see here, this is another energy equity issue. This is kilowatt hours, and you look at the northern Mediterranean, and you look at the southern Mediterranean. Northern Mediterranean is 3.8 times greater per capita consumption than the southern Mediterranean, but you look at Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria and compare that to the northern Mediterranean, and you can see some of the issues that the energy related issues that we're dealing with right now. That provides me a nice segue to electricity. And as I said, I'm going to talk more about water for energy than energy for water because I'm an energy person. And so I wanted to focus a little bit on electricity. This is kind of a boring once through and wet tower or pond thermal generation technologies that people at MIT love. And this is just a schematic, and I just wanted to, these are two prevalent types of generation, and importantly, globally and in the U.S. Are the water withdrawals and consumption. In the U.S., this cooling accounts for about 40% of water withdrawals. So the types of technologies that we are using for generating power are very important for water. They're important. This is because these different types of technologies raise issues of competition between policy goals, and those are water requirements, energy equity, and climate mitigation issues. The once through that I just showed you, it's low water consumption, a mature technology, and low capital costs. A wet tower or pond is significantly lower water withdrawal, more consumption, and it's a mature technology. And then dry, which is zero or minimal water withdrawal or consumption, important new technology, but these are the numbers in the U.S. 43% of our generation is once through, 53% are wet tower or ponds, and only 4% are dry cooling or a hybrid of dry cooling. And the cooling towers for your wet tower involve 95% less water withdrawal. But they also consume more water, and they have capital costs that are 2 times as much as the once through. When you get down to the dry, which doesn't use, consume, or withdraw water, it's good for the environment and for water consumption, but it's 5 times, the capital costs are 5 times higher than your once through, and they are far less efficient. So that's where you start seeing competition between water and energy and impacts on climate change. When you have when you have less efficient power generation, you are contributing to greenhouse gases. And so there are issues here and trade-offs between these technologies, and sometimes competition between the goals of water scarcity and water abundance and climate change. And this is one of them. Here's another area where it's a problem. These are the blue is consumption of water without carbon capture technologies. The darker blue and the aqua is what the water consumption that you add when you do carbon capture on combined cycle natural gas, pulverized coal, supercritical coal, and IGCCs. So there is a parasitic load in efficiency that you pay for carbon capture, and you also use a lot more water. So another thing that if we want to do an all of the above energy strategy and use carbon capture technologies around the world, you need to figure out how to reduce your water consumption and your energy consumption for carbon capture. I'm going to talk now about, I mentioned the Secretary is in Paris today at COP21. Last Monday, a week ago today, the President went to Paris and announced an initiative called Mission Innovation. And Mission Innovation, 20 countries of the world came together and signed on to an agreement. They didn't sign an agreement. I don't want to. It could be called a treaty. But 20 countries agreed to double their clean energy R&D in the next 5 years, and that is not an inconsequential doubling. And let me tell you why. These are the 20 countries. Okay, when you look there, those countries span 5 continents. They represent 60% of the world's population and the top 5 most populous countries in the world. So this was a pretty big deal. This coalition emits 2/3 of the world's greenhouse gases and nearly 3/4 of the CO2 emissions from electricity. The GDP in these 20 countries represents about 70% of the global total. Importantly here, and I said the doubling is not trivial, is that it represents over 80% of all the governments in the world's investment in clean energy R&D. So this is an enormous commitment, and I think that certainly in the water for energy space, there are a lot of opportunities for technology, some of which I just described, and technology investment that will deal with both climate change and with the water issues that we're talking about. Just a few factoids on these 20 countries as well. 4 of 20 of these countries get 60 to 92% of their electricity from hydro. As I mentioned, hydro is a problem in places like South America where the glaciers are melting. So you have a huge interest either in adaptation technologies or in mitigating climate change. Six of these countries get 30 to 91% of their power from natural gas. The UAE is on there. They get 98% of their power from natural gas. 6 get 40 to 76% of their power from coal. Okay, this is problematic, as you might imagine, from a climate perspective and from an environmental perspective in general. I don't know if you all saw, I think it was a photo in the New York Times where there was a red alert declared in China because of air pollution. What you can see there, China is the highest, 76%, India 74%, Australia 68%. I was surprised by that. And Germany, I was surprised, 46% coal, even though they have substantial incentives for renewables. They generate a lot of their electricity more than we do with coal. This is a little bit about the Mission Innovation Partners and the Water Energy Nexus specifically. France is was one of the main leaders of mission innovation, and worked with the U.S. and Indonesia, surprisingly, were the 3 countries that were major leaders in this. France is vulnerable because they have a lot of nuclear, and that implies a lot of water dependency. You might have noticed on the previous slides how much water is required for nuclear. China, we just mentioned, it's coal-rich and it's water-poor. They are working with us and doing a lot of research on coal-fired power generation, but it's problematic. Here you have Qatar and Australia, although Qatar's not a member, just Australia is. They are increasingly reliant on desalinated water for drinking, and desalination is very expensive. And India is highly reliant on inefficient coal-fired generation, and about 400 million people in India don't have access to electricity. And so they are going to be building out their power generation. The Modi's has announced a goal of universal access, I believe, by 2022. And they have a lot of lignite in India, and so that's problematic as well, and will require a lot of water in addition to contributing to climate change. Hold on, let me go back. Just a little bit about energy and water intersections in the United States. So that's a little international and challenges. And now here's a few thoughts about the what's going on in the U.S. I said we always have to have one Sankey diagram. Now I have 2. This has water and energy on it. Water is in billions of gallons per day. The U.S. Total is 404 billion gallons of water per day. 65% of that is fresh surface water, 20% fresh groundwater, 14% saline surface water, so that's your brackish water and seawater, and then 1% is saline groundwater. So that's how it breaks out here in the U.S. What we have available. That's a little messed up slide. 48% of that water is for thermoelectric cooling. I mentioned the cooling towers before. That's the cooling technologies and generation technologies. That's why. 11% is for public supply. 17% of our fresh water supply goes to public water. And 50% of this fresh surface water is fresh surface water, and 42% is fresh groundwater for your public water supply. Energy. These are in quads per year, these are 2011 numbers. 96 quads of energy consumption. We're doing all right on quads. In the Clinton administration, we were at 100. So we have reduced our energy consumption here. I just noticed that. 40% of that is for electricity. 66% of thermal generation is coal and nuclear. Okay, so again, we go back to the thermal technologies and that I described earlier. 34% is natural gas. And just a little bit about drought in the U.S. I'm sure you've all read about this as well. California drought is cited as the worst recorded in 1,200 years. That's important for many, many reasons, but that California is the breadbasket of the United States in part. Huge agriculture business there, and in fact, its economy is larger now than Italy's and Russia's, and it's the world's 8th largest economy. And so when you have a 1,200-year drought in the 8th largest economy, it's felt in a lot of other places. On the flip side of that, and as I mentioned, we have a lot of flooding in 4 days in 2014, damage to 70,000 structures. I just did a side note, my son moved to Houston a year ago, and he's had 2 floods where he's had to, where they have closed down his office, and he has been unable to go to work. And that is in the course of a year, significant flooding in Houston. And the number of flooding days in the U.S. has increased markedly since the middle of the last century by as much as 900%. This photo here is Annapolis and Baltimore, where you've got flooding. This is another way to look at what I just described. These are billion-dollar disaster events by year and type. So you have a whole drought, cyclone, flooding, wildfires. Yellow is severe storms. And in 2011, we had a huge spike in billion-dollar weather events, but they've come back down. But what hasn't come down is the yellow bar, and the yellow part of that bar, and those are severe storms that are costing us $1 billion or more. And so you're seeing increased precipitation in parts of the world and significant problems from rain for our infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned earlier on the energy for water and water for energy, and this is a slide that is it's from the Quadrennial Energy Review. It's a study that my office did, and this was about shared infrastructure in ports and waterways. And I thought I would put this in here. One of the water for energy uses that I showed you earlier was transport and conveyance. And I don't think that people realize in the United States, I certainly didn't before I did this Quadrennial Energy Review, 15% of all our petroleum products consumed in the United States in any given year are transported on our inland waterways. The United States has the largest inland waterway system in the world, and when you have that much oil and petroleum products transported on those waterways, it is highly problematic when you have either droughts or floods. And it has been in the past, it will be in the future. And another thing, 55% of all U.S. waterborne cargo by weight is moving through these ports and waterways. And just a little aside, that cartoon there, that is the Calcasieu Ship Channel. And the ship channel where we are going to very shortly be shipping LNG through this ship channel has often silts in. And what you see on the left is what the authorized dimensions of that ship channel are, and on the right is how the ship channel is at times. And the pilots on that ship channel call it self-dredging, and that's what that little cartoon is about. And we need to invest a lot more money in the Corps of Engineers to dredge those ports and to manage those waterways. And it's increasingly difficult because of climate change. I'm going to skip over this one and just mention a couple of technologies. Carbon desalination, low carbon desalination. The electricity costs in desalination are about 1/3 to 1/2 of the total costs. You saw when I showed you earlier Australia and Qatar, for example, are increasingly dependent on desalination for their drinking water. And so this is one of the technologies that in a mission innovation type initiative, I would be investing in these advanced desal technologies in order to reduce those costs and deal with the precipitation shortages and water stresses that I also showed you in a slide. It is, quite frankly, an adaptation technology that we need to really think about as we go forward. This is another a technology that we should be thinking about to get the electricity we need without water withdrawals or water consumption. And these are advanced dry cooling technologies we are investing in at the Department of Energy. And we need to do a lot more work in these if we are to address all of the issues and some of the conflicting issues that I described, climate change, energy equity, and water consumption and withdrawals. And then finally, let me close with some policy and technology goals for energy and water. The first is to optimize freshwater efficiency of energy production, generation, and end-use systems, as I just mentioned. Optimize the energy efficiency of water management, treatment, distribution, and end-use systems. Enhance, that's there twice. I just said that. Enhance the reliability and resilience of energy and water systems. Increase safe and productive use of non-traditional water sources, promote responsible energy operations with respect to water quality, ecosystem, and seismic impacts, and exploit productive synergies among water and energy systems. And let me say in closing, this energy-water nexus is a hugely important issue. As I mentioned, I am approaching this from the perspective of water for energy, and that's because I'm an energy expert. I am not a water expert, but when I was preparing for this this talk, I will also tell you that we don't have the kind of information and data that we need on water like we do on energy. I went to the World Bank to look at energy and water. They have great databases, the World Bank. They had 15, 20 databases. I pulled out the 20 countries in mission innovation, 15, 20 databases for energy. They had 2 or 3 for water, and the 2 or 3 for water of the 20 countries, you would see information from 5 or 6 countries and blanks for the other countries. So that's globally, we don't have the kind of information that we need. You have the same problem here in the United States. At the Department of Energy, we have an Energy Information Administration. We don't have a Water Information Administration anywhere. I'm not quite sure where you would locate a Water Information Administration within the government. It's very, very cross-cutting. We had a workshop on these issues, and USGS, U.S. Geological Service, seemed to be the place for it, but it is a long and complicated process to start gathering and building up the information that you need and to effectively manage energy for water as opposed to water for energy. And there are many things that we know anecdotally. We have a lot of information about some of the things that are going on in California. We don't have a huge amount of information in many states or nationwide. Interestingly enough, where we have the best information on water is in states that don't have it. I'm from New Mexico. Good information on water, not so much in, say, Virginia, or I don't know. I don't want to hear about from the Virginians. They have great information on water. But places where there are a lot of water, you have, obviously, you don't have scarcity. You don't have the water compacts that you have in places in the West, like you have in places in the West, and river rights and Colorado River all the way down to Mexico, and the rights that the various states have. So I know it sounds boring, and I say it a lot, but do not underestimate the value of good data, and we really, really need it about energy for water. We have a lot more about water for energy, and both are hugely important issues. We know there is a significant nexus. I've described the water for energy, and hope that in the near future we can get better data on energy for water. So thank you very much. Thank you.
That was tremendous. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melanie. A lot to talk about, and like I said, I want to make sure we have a couple of minutes too to look beyond water and talk about some of the other energy policy issues out there and take advantage of your visiting with us here at Columbia. But let me just ask, let me see how much, we have about a half hour for questions, and I'll ask a couple just to get the conversation going and then open it up to everyone here in the audience. And I appreciate the call at the end for good data and good research, the role that researchers at a place like Columbia can play in all this. But I mean, I think the slide you left up there is actually a really interesting one to sort of ask you a question or two about, because what we are doing here, particularly at the School of International and Public Affairs, where the Energy Center sits, is thinking about the intersection between the research on some of the core science issues and what the role of policy is. What do we do about it? So I'm curious, if you could say another word about that. When you look at something like this, if I see the penultimate bullet, right, promote responsible energy operations, well, there's a set of rules that the EPA or the Department of Interior or others and at the state level with regard to energy production to try to make sure that water resources are protected in that process. But when you think, I mean, you described a lot of different challenges, right? Stress on water resources from climate change, the water resources that are used for energy production, the energy that is used to develop water, like through desalination and other things. How do you, what do you see as the most pressing challenges that intersect with energy and water, and what's the role for government to address them? What policy issues do you think need to kind of be taken to the next level, and what's government's role in this challenge you described?
I think that one of the most difficult challenges, and I'm just going to talk about the U.S. here. We're working through Mission Innovation and other international organizations on some of the, and COP21 right now on policy issues. And so I'll just talk about the U.S. But I think that the competing objectives are the most problematic. You see where climate change is contributing to water scarcity, it's contributing to flooding, it's contributing to sea level rise, increased storms, et cetera, et cetera. And so obviously that is a huge problem. But you have energy equity issues. And you also, which I'm very concerned about, costs of energy, and for those that can least afford it in this country and around the world, or even access to energy. And but I also think that in the United States, our issues, both climate and energy, are very regional. And that we need to be looking at, have a regional focus on a lot of what we're doing. And we spend a lot of time in my office working with the states and trying to accommodate and replicate good state policies. And I can tell you from where I sit as a policy person, a lot of the technologies that we might use to address climate and reduce water consumption are completely, they are impeded by some of the jurisdictional issues that we deal with, and we cannot take full advantage of the technologies that we have because of how our electricity and energy markets are organized. And so I would start trying to break down some of those barriers by developing a more regional focus on some of our solutions.
I'm going to turn to my colleague Nicola de Blasio from the Energy Center in a minute, but just to broaden the lens on, you talked about the announcement of R&D made at the COP meeting in Paris, both private sector funds with Bill Gates and several other leading philanthropists, and then also from governments. Can you just say another word about how, if the U.S. government were to double spending on energy R&D, that's a large dollar amount for around $4.5 billion, how would it do that? Do you have any sense yet about how some of that money would be spent, or what areas it would be spent in? And are there intersections there with kind of the water issue?
You mentioned Bill Gates, and I actually forgot to mention Bill Gates. That's what happened when I went away from my handwritten notes. Bill Gates, when the president announced Mission Innovation in Paris a week ago, which was countries and their commitment to R&D, Bill Gates organized a group of private investors, 28 private investors from 10 different countries who are very interested in patient capital. They want to come in, make money off technologies, and that come out of an increased pipeline. If we put more money in the federal government, we'll have more projects coming out of the pipeline, and so they are very, very interested in that, and they agreed to invest in the government R&D projects that come out of the government pipeline in the countries that are participating in Mission Innovation. But I don't want to in any way imply that that's a closed loop. A lot of the technologies that we would develop have, like carbon capture and sequestration, those are as important, if not more so, in a place like India than they are in the United States. Although CCS might very well be a regional solution in the Midwest, where they have a lot of coal-fired power generation. That's what I mean by regional solutions. So we are very excited about their interest in this kind of patient capital and paying a lot of attention to what's coming out of the government. They don't get special access, and all investors are welcome. But the Gates Group and the governments that got together recognize that if we are to keep temperature rises within 2 to 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we need to accelerate what we're doing in innovation. So that's what this is all about. And I would say a couple of things. I like the dry cooling technology that I showed you. Another thing that I think is we really, really need is to invest in utility scale storage. Storage technologies, because you will always have the problem of intermittency with your renewable, with the wind and solar, certainly, if you don't solve the storage problem. So those are a couple of areas where increased government investment will create more options for the private sector to commercialize. And so those are a couple areas where I'd invest.
Great. Well, on the R&D topic too, you called out Peter Davidson earlier, non-resident fellow at the Energy Center, ran the DOE loan guarantee program, so maybe he'll step to the microphone and offer a word too on how those funds could be deployed. So, Nicola, do you want to come in?
Yes. So, Melanie, the question I have is that it's very true. It's all about regional. If you think about globally, I think it's 70% of the water, fresh water, is used for food production and only 20% for energy. And in the US, it's totally different. But then there are also cases where, and I'm thinking of, for example, dams, where you have fresh water induced stresses by the energy demand that happens somewhere else. And how do you think governments could define policy to address this issue?
To address dams and hydro?
Well, the fact that you have water stresses away from where you have the energy demand.
Well, I mean, that's a fairly universal problem you have with a lot of energy. You have the same problem with transmission lines. Yes. You have the same thing with pipelines and transit countries, where the infrastructure, the delivery infrastructure for energy is crossing regions of a country or a state or the world that have no vested interest in the product. They're not getting the advantages. We're having a lot of problems with that in some of our transmission lines as well. I think that that's a problem for governments to work out. It is not easy, and you have to figure out some benefits for the transit areas, quite frankly, and or the regions like in China where they are protesting some of the dams, et cetera, because they're not benefiting from it, and it's going to urban areas. It's also a problem with urbanization, where your energy is in remote areas, and it's a real problem in India. Their best solar resources are far from their energy demand, and so it's a package of incentives that you've got to work through. But most of those are specific to a government and internal to a country, and then you get cross-border pipelines, which is another problem entirely, and some of them take years and then don't go anywhere. So I've worked on a few of those myself.
So I have a lot of questions, but there's so much expertise in this room that I want to make sure to leave enough time for all of you to ask questions. So there's a microphone in the middle of the room, and if people could stand up and identify yourself, ask please brief questions to make sure that we get as many as possible, and we'll give Melanie a chance to respond.
Vasily Ftanakis, Columbia University, director the Center for Life Cycle Analysis and Engineering. And allow me a comment and a question. Actually, I'm an energy to water guy too, having worked in solar for very long. And I have been looking into the potential for solar energy and wind into desalination. And actually, it happens that the arid areas that they need the water desalination, they are very rich in solar resources. I've been looking into cost and so on, and I've seen that actually the least expensive desalination these days about 53 cents. 53 cents per cubic meter. 40% of this is the cost of energy.
Right.
So looking into actually the reduction in the solar electricity cost, we're talking about in those areas down to 5 to 6 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. We're talking about if we implement solar with some solution for variability, intermittency, with storage for water and so on, we can get the cost down to 20, 30 cents per cubic meter. That is close to water management over relatively long distances. So I'm really actually enthusiastic about the potential you mentioned that you have in your funding the water desalination areas, several of those. The question is, do you think that there is a need to support international research on that? I mean, you know, there are initiatives, let's say in Chile, for example, they start in a big program, putting serious money into desalination in the Emirates. Oh, by the way, perhaps may not know in the audience, but we have an initiative that was launched in Paris 2 days ago, the only initiative on water energy, International Desalination Agency and Masdar UA. And Colombia is a founding member. So actually, we have that. It was formed within the last 2 weeks. The question is international. Our DOE international programs don't have funding. I mean, I have been actually conducting them. They have only funding for monitoring. Years back, we had more funding on international programs. It seems now that we don't. So the question is, do you see the need perhaps for funding partnerships with others in this common endeavor of desalination and energy to water?
We actually, one of the, truth be told, I thought I was talking for an hour, so I prepared an hour's worth of slides, and I just didn't look at my schedule. And so I had to rush through some of them. One of the slides that I rushed through on desalination was advocacy for research in using renewables for desal, and which I like. I think it's fairly elegant because it uses both mitigation and adaptation technologies, so it takes care of some of the issues where you have the tension between water, emissions, efficiency, and all of those things. With desalination, you can address those with low-cost renewables. It is, however, a research area. We are always in need of funds. We don't control them, and we have some substantial international partnerships. We have a partnership with China. We have a partnership with India. My expert in my office on energy and water is in China right now, or she would have given a better talk on energy and water, because that is her area of expertise, but she is over there working with them right now at a center that we have. And it's the availability of funds, and as you mentioned, and we have a lot of international partnerships. I wish they were better funded, because these truly are international issues. But we'll see what happens. We don't have a budget. We don't have our appropriations for fiscal year 16 yet. Hopefully we will have those at the end of next week, I think. But it's just a matter of priorities, and there was a budget agreement reached by the White House and the Congress that puts a pretty strict limit on funds, and we've been operating under sequestration, and so it's prioritizing, and I wish we could do more, and I agree with you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
and
you.
thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Amy Larkin. I'm the author of Environmental Debt, The Hidden Costs of a Changing Global Economy, and I'm vice chair of the World Economic Forum's Climate Change Council. And you brought up the issue that everything's connected, and so I want to talk about those connections a bit. You talk about optimizing all kinds of policy. How about zoning policy? I was just in the UAE, which
Right.
is, in terms of a place where there's no water and no food, an astonishing place, or
It
just
is astonishing for having no water and no food, yeah.
well,
Yeah, yeah.
and then having been built
Right.
with oil money, so you could connect every problem in the world and put it right there. And I know that there are some solutions coming out of there, but it would be so much better if we didn't need the desalination. And so things like in the U.S. policy for zoning, you'd read about new building bonds, municipal bonds in Tempe, Arizona, and Las Vegas, Nevada. You think, why are they building one more building? And if we were to connect zoning, agriculture, forestry in there, is that something that's ever discussed?
Well,
Is that too complicated?
those issues aren't primarily the purview of the Department of Energy. So they are discussed in an interagency context. From where I sit, we spend a lot of time and focus a lot on end-use efficiency and buildings, et cetera, and so that's where we would come into a discussion like that, not necessarily in zoning per se, but in financing for energy efficiency. It's a problem.
Reduce is always the first
Yeah,
part of
reduce
the-
is always,
right.
it's the low-hanging fruit.
Right.
But it's also.
But we ignore it because it's cross-sectoral.
Well, it's also very dispersed. And yes, it's very dispersed, and so it's problematic from a policy perspective. I mentioned this quadrennial energy review that we did, and the first one, we've redefined quadrennial. We're doing not one every 4 years, but 4 installments. The last one will be the big summary document, but because energy is so broad and so everything is so connected, we didn't think that doing one large comprehensive energy plan would get us actionable recommendations. So the first one was on transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. The next one is on electricity, soup to nuts. And in that, we are going to be doing valuation of a range of things that are not currently valued. Efficiency is very, very difficult to value.
Right.
Baseload power, very different. I mean, your rates are very simple in general. And so if we could value some things and track those values with things like zoning, I think that it would, we could capture more of the low-hanging fruit.
Fabulous presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions, please, please come up. As I said, have many. So you talked about things, you put a slide up that showed how much product we move by water and how much congestion there can be on the water. And I know that one of the issues you've spent a lot of time on is thinking about bottlenecks with regard to our strategic petroleum reserve. So I just, like I said, I want to cover a couple of broader issues while we have the benefit of your being with us here. But can you tell us what the challenge is and what's being done to address it?
For those of you who don't reside in the world of strategic petroleum reserve and oil, the SPR was established in 78, I believe, after the oil embargoes of 1974. And at that point in time, there actually were physical disruptions of oil. We didn't have a global oil market, and the SPR, it's in Louisiana and Texas, and the oil is stored primarily in salt domes in that part of the world. And the SPR was designed to move oil from the Gulf of Mexico up to the refineries in the Midwest in the event of an actual physical disruption of oil. Well, now you fast forward 40 years later or so, and the Midwestern refineries are very, very well supplied by Bakken and Canadian oil. And so they don't need SPR oil. And there's now a global oil market. And in a global oil market, the law for the SPR says that the purpose of the SPR is to mitigate harm to the U.S. economy from an oil disruption. And harm to the U.S. economy now is if you have a huge price spike or price volatility because there's a global oil market. And so we have to look at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a very different way. It's 700 million barrels of oil that's sitting in the ground. And because we have our oil profile has changed so dramatically just in the last 10 years. We're now the largest oil and gas producer in the world. When I was there in the Clinton administration at the end, we were going to be importing gas. We're now exporting gas. But all of that oil is still moving into the Gulf of Mexico. Over 50% of our refining capacity is in the Gulf of Mexico. And the Strategic Petroleum Reserve shares infrastructure with domestic commercial operators in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we started to see problems in the Libya, when we used the SPR in Libya, that we could actually distribute oil from the SPR, its distribution system, but we were shutting in our own production because there's so much competition for commercial space pipelines. Some of the pipelines have been reversed to accommodate new production areas. And so we have been working, I've talked to Jason a lot about this, working to modernize our Strategic Petroleum Reserve by putting new dedicated docks to get that oil out onto the water, which is where you need it. And I think have about $2 billion to do that to help protect the U.S. economy. So,
Peter.
Hi, Peter.
Good to see you, Melanie.
Good to see you too.
So 2 questions. First, a lot of great data and charts here. So I'm wondering, is that publicly available, like the quadrennial energy?
As soon as I
review?
go through and put all of the citations on there, which I was just working on them over the weekend, and I will make it available. My staff always has to go through and find the citations after,
Well, also
after
maybe just-
most of them have them, but
And
yes.
maybe everyone should just know about the quadrennial energy review is available.
Right,
Right. Okay.
great.
Right.
So-
Okay. So then the question, on the energy side, we spend a lot of time thinking about putting a price on carbon. So cap and trade or carbon tax, which we always think about for energy. I'm just wondering, has the analysis been done on were there to be a carbon tax, what the impact is on water usage, and how that contributes to the whole debate about the carbon tax?
It's funny because I think you would probably, we haven't done that, okay? Maybe somebody has, I haven't. but you might have competing issues, okay? Because a carbon tax would presumably do things like provide incentives to nuclear, but nuclear uses more water. And as does right now carbon capture and sequestration. And so again, it's the tension between some of these climate issues and water issues that you might see, but I haven't done any analysis, but I'll check it out for you, Peter.
Well, and from a policy perspective, it's interesting because we know that
Right, it
effort
is,
has
yeah.
been stalled, and if you can bring nobody's anti-water and clean water, so to
Right.
bring those voices to the argument could be very helpful.
Well, and obviously, many economists talk about pricing carbon, but lots of economists talk about pricing water, too, to
Right,
reflect
right,
its
they
market
do.
cost, right? So,
And we need it. We need the water infrastructure in the country needs some improvement, as does our energy infrastructure, which is what the quadrennial energy review is about. And so we need a lot of work. So
next question, please.
Martin Schoon, Brookhaven National Lab. I'm part of a group that's actually across various different national labs working on this issue. And as you may know, the last big idea summit that Secretary Moniz had, this is one of the areas that he likes to think of putting more money into it. Realistically, which of these two pillars, if you will, the energy for water and water for energy, where do you think DOE can really realistically take the lead, given all of the stakeholders that are involved in this issue?
well, I mean, again, my focus is water for energy, and I think that that's more in the Department of Energy's lane. As I said, we don't have a water information administration, and if we did, I wouldn't necessarily locate that at the Department of Energy. Okay, and I would view energy for water as another demand. Okay, I mean, that's from my perspective, it's just one of the many pieces of demand. The problem is that we don't have good data on that, and so this is just my personal opinion. I would come down on the water for energy because that's more the technologies that we work on. It's more in our wheelhouse, and would view energy for water as a component of demand. You do get into issues where you say, as we've said many times, the tensions between climate, water, and energy, but that's an interagency process as well, and which lab do you work at?
Brookhaven National Lab.
You're at Brookhaven,
Yeah.
yeah. Which explains why you're in New York, right?
right.
So, thanks, thank you.
Um,
The labs did great work with us on the QER, and they're on the next one too. So,
No one's asked quite about this topic yet, but I do want to ask. I mean, you know a lot about natural gas. You were with the Gas Technology Institute. You've worked on gas and shale gas in particular for a long time before most people knew what it was, and it's an issue that generates a lot of controversy around water, and we see that here in New York State certainly with the moratorium on shale development. So can you talk about that intersection and what you think kind of the issues are that you're most concerned about, and maybe what issues you think it sort of aren't as big a concern as some people make them out to be, and what is being done at the federal level or at state levels also? What's that right balance to make sure that we develop these resources with adequate protection for water?
actually, when I found out that this was shorter than my talk needed to be shorter than I had planned, I took a slide out on water use and shale gas, a comparative slide across, like water for shale gas compared to golf courses or municipal water or mining and extraction. Other extraction industries, and it's a very, very small amount of water. But I don't want to minimize that. It's a very small amount of water, but you use it all at once. That's the problem. And it's not going to, compared to golf courses or swimming pools or whatever, it's not going to put a huge strain on water supply, but it puts a very significant strain on local water supplies and local water treatment. And so it's episodic. and it's large and episodic. And right now, the produced water is causing problems. The seismic activity from shale gas production is not from actual fracking. It is from injecting the produced wastewater from drilling a well, where they aggregate large amounts from many, many wells. They aggregate it in one location, and that's where your seismic issues that's where you're having problems, not from fracking itself. And there is the National Academy has looked at that and developed some guidelines on where you should be fracking, where you should be disposing based on seismic activity, and so you do have to dispose of that water. You have to dispose of water from any kind of oil or gas production, and so it's just an issue that has to be dealt with.
So the takeaway from that seismic concern is to therefore inject in different certain places but not others, do more recycling of water, is that?
Yeah, more recycling. You want to recycle so that you can use that water, and it's a desalination process in and of itself. That's another area where you would want to lower the costs of that, so that you can reuse that water. That's certainly a solution. You don't want to be disposing of large amounts of water in seismically active areas, and that's what the guidelines were for the National Academy, and the when I've always thought on fracking that you have to know a little bit about the structure of the U.S. industry. When the technologies were developed to actually do hydraulic fracturing, the super majors had gone offshore and around the world. They weren't producing gas here at home, other than offshore, because it wasn't economic. The conventional wells were not as productive. And so it was the smaller independent producers that picked up the technologies and diffuse those technologies into the marketplace. Now the super majors have now moved back into shale gas development, but I think it was that period of time when it was small independent producers that were kind of overwhelming what were rural areas, and there were significant impacts on local water treatment systems, on local roads, et cetera, and I think that we underestimated the impacts of that development on communities. I think the industry did, and it's more regularized and more regulated now than it was when it started out, and these are very challenging problems, but we think that they are manageable. So
Great. I wish we had a lot more time, but this has been a great conversation. I think for us, as I said, so much interesting work being done at Columbia on issues at the intersection of water and energy. It's why we at the Center on Global Energy Policy have developed a research program focused on issues at the water energy nexus and are working with lots of our partners across the university on this. I think you've heard, it's good to hear the validation of how important that topic is and how broad that research agenda needs to be. You hopefully have heard how valuable federal funding of university research is, and can take that message back to Washington. But we hope we can keep in touch on this and continue to produce work that's valuable to policymakers, and really appreciate your spending time with us to let us know how folks in Washington and at the Energy Department are thinking about this. So please join me in thanking
one thing on that.
Yeah,
one thing on that. As I'm working and looking at my kind of regions analytically, if I were queen of the world and we're looking at regions in the United States, and we've analytically derived regions based on a bunch of things. The first thing I put on that map was research universities. Okay, so
that's the bias of someone who went from MIT to the Energy Department.
Right.
Well, so again, thank you for being with us, and please join me in thanking Melanie for spending time with us in New York.
Thank you.